If you've ever looked at a new Digimon game and thought, I don't have the energy for a huge RPG right now, this one might surprise you. Time Stranger is massive, but it's also strangely comfortable to just sit inside, like a menu screen you never quite leave. Tonight, we're not speedrunning anything. We're just going to slowly drift through what makes this game quietly special. The long road it took to exist, the strange disaster in Shinjuku, the gods of data over ILIAD, and the little design choices that make late-night grinding feel meditative. This is more like letting someone tell you stories about a new world while you slowly lose track of the time. Settle in, get comfortable. Whether you're a long-time fan or just curious, let the facts of this massive yet strangely calming RPG carry you toward your dreams. One of the most interesting things is that players knew it existed long before they ever saw a trailer or a logo. For years, producers kept mentioning a new story project in interviews, while other Digimon games released first, which turned this entry into a kind of long-running promise instead of a surprise announcement. From the beginning, the team framed Time Stranger as a game that would lean heavily into the digital world side of things. They talked about wanting to build a story around the OLYMPOS 12, a group of powerful Digimon that had appeared in cards and side material, but never truly sat at the center of a mainline story game before. Another quieter detail is how early they decided this would be a proper console RPG rather than a handheld-style title. That decision affected everything, from the way Digimon are animated, to how wide the camera pulls back in certain scenes, because the artists suddenly had more room for lighting, particle effects, and more expressive movement. You can feel that extra space just by watching Digimon idle in menus or during battle intros. Instead of simple loops, many of them have small secondary animations, tail flicks, breathing motions, weapon shifts that weren't practical on older hardware, but now make them feel more like living characters. Time Stranger also leans very hard into the identity of being a story game. That label isn't just branding. It signals that the focus will be on narrative depth, branching evolutions, and heavier themes, in contrast to some spin-offs that are more about quick matches or experimental systems. Another detail many players appreciate is how the game quietly tries to welcome people who know Digimon only from the anime. The designs, UI, and partner choices are all clearly aimed at fans of adventure in later seasons, but the text avoids assuming that you already know every term or every previous game. The soundtrack is another place where the developers linked Time Stranger back to the rest of the franchise. The composer brings in electronic textures and slow, pulsing rhythms that echo Cyber Sleuth, but layers them with new motifs tied specifically to time, distortion, and the Olympos Digimon that watch over ILIAD. On top of the original score, the game also folds in nostalgia very deliberately. Optional tracks from the anime can be used in battles, turning random encounters into little bursts of memory for anyone who grew up with those openings and inserts, while players who prefer a calmer soundscape can simply leave the default music on. All of these choices add up to something subtle but important. Time Stranger doesn't just want to be the new one in the series. It wants to feel like a point where years of Digimon games, shows, and music quietly converge in one place, wrapped in a modern RPG shell that's comfortable to live in for dozens of hours at a time. What makes that convergence even more interesting is how long the idea sat in public view without a face. Every time a producer repeated that the next story game is coming, but showed something else instead, it quietly raised expectations that, when it finally arrived, it had to feel like more than just another spin-off. You can see that weight in how polished the first reveal trailer looked. It didn't just show raw battle footage, it jumped between Tokyo streets, ILIAD vistas, partner close-ups, and UI shots, almost as if it was trying to reassure every type of fan at once that their corner of Digimon was being represented. Platform choice plays into that same feeling. By targeting modern consoles and PC right out of the gate, Time Stranger signaled that it wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with other big RPG releases of its generation, not just live on older hardware as a niche curiosity. Even the way information was rolled out before launch says a lot about the project's priorities. Early previews focused on story and setting, later ones drilled into evolution systems and combat depth, and only after that did marketing lean on things like anime music packs and special editions. as if the team wanted to establish substance before surface. The playable demo that arrived shortly before release acted like a small stress test for all of that build-up. Players were given just enough time with SHINJUKU, early battles, and basic team building to decide whether this was the sort of Digimon game they could sink an entire season into. Reactions from that trial period often mention the same combination of traits. People talked about how dense the evolution menus felt, how smooth the battle flow was even at higher speeds, and how strangely comforting it was to wander through high-definition city streets with a partner trailing just behind. Merchandise and bonus content quietly reinforced the idea that Time Stranger was meant to anchor a particular era of the franchise. Pre-order items, art books, and soundtrack releases treated the game less like a one-off experiment and more like a flagship entry whose designs and concepts would ripple outward into other media. Even small branding choices, like how the logo balances sharp digital edges with softer curves, feed into the overall mood. It looks modern and technical, but there's just enough warmth in the composition that it doesn't feel cold or clinical when you see it on a home screen late at night. By the time you actually sit down to play, all of these background details have done their work quietly. You're stepping into a game that feels like it has been waiting in the wings for years, carrying expectations from older titles, promises from interviews, and a whole stack of musical and visual callbacks that only really land once you're inside the world for yourself. Another small background detail sits in how the game was positioned for different regions. Marketing never leaned too hard into niche terminology or deep-cut lore in trailers. Instead, it showed clear partner designs, clean battle snippets, and just enough hints of ILIAD to make newcomers curious without confusing people who only knew Digimon from TV. Behind that, though, interviews and preview articles often went much deeper. Developers talked about evolution routes, data structures, and the logic behind the OLYMPOS Digimon in a way that clearly targeted longtime fans, almost as if the public conversation was split into two layers, depending on how closely you were paying attention. Localization choices reflect the same balancing act. Menus, tutorials, and in-game explanations are written to be readable even if Time Stranger is your first exposure to Digimon. But small phrasing choices and specific term translations nudge veterans to notice connections to older games and anime arcs. Box art and key visuals quietly communicate the game's priorities before you ever press start. The protagonist is usually placed between a grounded, modern city backdrop and a more abstract digital landscape, with one or two prominent partners in front and faint Olympos silhouettes watching from above, hinting at a story stretched between street level and god level. Even the way partners are framed in promotional images says something. They're rarely posed as simple mascots. Instead, they often stand shoulder to shoulder with the protagonist, or slightly behind, like allies in a shared problem rather than pets following a trainer. Preview events and demos tended to focus on a specific slice of the experience. Players were given time with early SHINJUKU segments, basic exploration, and a handful of early evolution options, but the most complex systems and late-game forms were held back, preserving the sense that the full game still had many layers underneath that first taste. On social media and community forums, this created a familiar pattern. Newer players asked basic questions about how evolutions and stats worked, while longtime Digimon fans tried to reverse engineer entire line charts and mechanics from a few seconds of footage or a single translated comment from a developer. By the time launch rolled around, Time Stranger felt less like an isolated release and more like the endpoint of a quiet, multi-year conversation between the studio and its audience. Developers had spent years promising a proper story follow-up. Fans had spent just as long speculating about what that meant, and the final game arrived carrying all of those expectations in the background without ever needing to say so on the box. One of the easiest details to miss about the SHINJUKU opening is how unusual it is for a monster collecting game to start with a protagonist who already knows the creatures are real. You're not a kid discovering Digimon for the first time. You're an Adamus operative who treats digital anomalies as part of a regular workday. That choice lets the game skip the usual "What are Digimon" tutorial and jump straight into showing how a professional organization responds when something feels wrong. Your character talks in the language of reports, readings, and protocols, which makes the moment when those tools fail feel much more dramatic. Shinjuku wasn't picked at random either. The district has appeared in other Digimon media and in countless Japanese games. So many players already have a mental picture of its streets and stations, which makes its collapse in Time Stranger feel more like watching a familiar landmark being erased than a generic city being destroyed. The gradual glitches you see before the main incident hits are a good example of how the game uses visual language as information. Small distortions in lights and textures hint that the local data layer is under stress long before the story names the Shinjuku Inferno as a specific event. Internally, Adamus treats these readings like they've seen similar patterns before, just not at this scale. Their calm, measured responses, the way they ask for confirmation, escalation, or fallback, help sell the idea that you're stepping into an already established system that simply wasn't built for what's about to happen. Another interesting detail is that Shinjuku's destruction is not framed as a standard boss fight gone wrong. You do not defeat the cause of the anomaly and reset the area. Instead, the event becomes a fixed point in the timeline, something the rest of the narrative has to work around rather than erase. The time shift that follows turns this whole opening into a kind of playable flash-forward. You experience one version of Shinjuku's fate first, then spend the rest of the game walking through an earlier period where nobody remembers that night, giving every later anomaly an extra layer of tension. From a design perspective, this structure quietly pushes players to pay attention to small details in both time periods. A piece of equipment, a line of dialogue, or an experiment that seems minor in the past might match something you saw in the ruined Shinjuku, inviting you to make connections the characters can't see yet. It also changes how you read Adamus as a group. Once you've seen how completely their systems fail in Shinjuku, later protocol briefings and confident statements start to sound different, less like solid rules and more like people trying to assert control over something that has already proven it can outrun them. In that sense, the Shinjuku prologue isn't just a dramatic set piece. It's a carefully constructed information dump disguised as a disaster scene, teaching you how anomalies look at their worst, how the organization reacts when pushed beyond its limits, and how fragile the line between the human world and ILIAD really is, all before the real investigation even begins. The Shinjuku mission also quietly doubles as a hands-on tutorial for how the game thinks about data. Your instruments, scanners, and UI readouts aren't just there for flavor. They teach you to watch numbers and graphs the same way you watch enemy HP bars, because both are warning lights that something is about to go wrong. Even early prompts, like checking abnormal values or confirming coordinates, are doing double duty. They explain basic controls to new players, but they also show how Adamus treats the digital layer as something you can measure, graph, and report on, long before it becomes a visible threat. The way the camera moves in this sequence reinforces that idea. Angles linger on screens, wires, and antenna clusters, almost nudging you to think of Shinjuku as a giant machine wrapped in concrete and glass, instead of just a backdrop for a fight. Lighting in these scenes is carefully tuned to feel believable first and ominous second. You get the standard neon and traffic glow you'd expect from a city at night, but as the anomaly grows, those familiar colors start to desaturate and flicker, like the palette is being overwritten one shade at a time. Sound design carries just as much information as the HUD. At first you hear normal environmental noise, cars, distant chatter, station announcements, and then, without calling attention to it, those sounds thin out and are replaced by hums, glitches, and low drones sitting under the soundtrack. Radio chatter from Adamus isn't only there to make the world feel busy. The tone of the operators subtly shifts from routine to strained as readings climb, even if the words remain professional and measured, giving you an emotional barometer for the situation before the visuals catch up. Even the first glimpses of the anomaly are staged more like software bugs than a monster reveal. Lines of light only half render, surfaces ripple with compression artifact patterns, and parts of the sky behave like a video buffer that keeps trying and failing to stabilize. It's telling that you see all of this before the game asks you to think about type matchups or damage formulas. The message is that understanding disturbances and recognizing when the world is off matters just as much as knowing which move is super effective. The Shinjuku Inferno also sets a baseline for scale. Later anomalies might look impressive on their own, but your brain keeps comparing them to that first night, measuring how close they feel to pushing the world over the same edge. Because you fail to resolve this first disaster, every subsequent mission carries a bit of that memory. When a later incident is described as small or contained, it's hard not to hear that as not Shinjuku level, even if the characters never say it out loud. NPC behavior during the opening adds another layer of detail. A few pedestrians react to glitches with confusion rather than terror, checking phones or screens as if they're dealing with a minor outage, which sells the idea that smaller anomalies have been happening for a while. Once the situation escalates beyond what anyone has seen before, the city doesn't immediately descend into chaos. For a short, eerie stretch, you watch people and objects fall out of normal physics almost calmly, as if the world is lagging rather than exploding. Camera framing during the worst moments tends to avoid hyper-dramatic close-ups. Instead, it prefers wide shots that show landmarks dissolving, lights bending, and entire sections of the skyline being swallowed, which makes the event feel systemic rather than targeted. There's a strong contrast between how the lead reacts and how the environment behaves. You can sense urgency and fear in the dialogue and expressions, while the city itself disintegrates with a weird, almost clinical smoothness, like a program shutting down. Mechanically, the game uses this sequence to introduce the idea that you can't always win by simply out-leveling or out-planning. No amount of preparation in this moment would have let you beat Shinjuku, and that lesson echoes later when you're dealing with threats that feel more like structural failures than personal enemies. The forced jump back in time turns the entire prologue into a reference point for the rest of the story. Every time someone mentions risk levels, collapse thresholds, or network strain, your brain goes right back to those streets and the way the sky looked just before everything broke. From a pacing standpoint, opening with the worst-case scenario is a bold move. Many RPGs start small and build up slowly. Time Stranger shows you the endpoint first, then asks you to walk the long, quieter road leading up to it from the other direction. That structure changes how you read early slice-of-life scenes in the past. What might have felt like gentle prologue moments in another game instead become chances to spot ingredients of the disaster before they're mixed together. It also gives Shinjuku a strange presence, even when you're nowhere near it. Other districts, labs, and digital zones are constantly being compared in your head to that one night, turning the Inferno into a mental yardstick for everything else you encounter. Small visual callbacks help reinforce this. A damaged sign in a later timeline, a stray news broadcast, or a warped texture in ILIAD that vaguely matches a real-world structure can all trigger a quick flash of recognition for anyone who remembers the opening clearly. Fans often describe the Shinjuku segment as feeling like a mini-movie, but it's more useful to think of it as a playable thesis. It quietly lays out every major thread, time distortion, overloaded systems, the limit of AtomS protocols, the fragility of city spaces, and then hands you a version of the world where none of those threads have been pulled yet. When you eventually piece together how human experiments, OLYMPOS decisions, and increased traffic between worlds connect back to this one night, the prologue stops being just a cool intro. It becomes the moment where all those systems finally collide in a way that nobody can ignore, including the player. By then, you've spent so many hours seeing smaller anomalies that the original disaster feels even more grounded. You understand which readings were ignored, which warnings were downplayed, and which habits people refused to change, so Shinjuku reads less like a random tragedy and more like the inevitable result of everything that came before it. That's why the sequence stays with players long after the credits roll. It isn't only memorable because of the spectacle, it's memorable because every menu, mission, and piece of lore afterward quietly reminds you that you're trying to thread a new path around a night you've already lived through once. One of the most unusual choices in Time Stranger is that it treats the main character as two people instead of one. You don't just pick a customizable avatar. You choose between Dan and KANAN Yuki, and the one you don't choose stays in the story as a full character with their own scenes, reactions, and involvement. This means the game never has to pretend that an unused protagonist doesn't exist. If you pick Dan, KANAN isn't erased from canon. She becomes someone you interact with, watch grow, and sometimes even quietly compare yourself to, as the plot unfolds. The reverse is true as well. Choosing KANAN lets you see Dan from the outside, which can make his choices and body language feel more like those of a distinct person, rather than an empty player shell. A small detail many players pick up on is how their personalities are reflected in subtle animations and dialogue pacing. Dan's lines tend to land a bit more directly, while KANAN's reads and pauses can suggest that she's processing the situation from a more observational angle. The game uses those differences to change how certain scenes feel without rewriting the entire script. A conversation about anomalies or ILIAD might carry a slightly different tone depending on which sibling is asking the questions and which is hanging back, listening. Around them sits a cast of humans that makes the world feel lived in rather than just like a quest-giver hub. Inori MISONO is a good example. She is introduced as a researcher, but her scenes are filled with small human details like stress over deadlines, awkward pauses around her father, and the kind of tired enthusiasm you only see in people who care too much about their work. Kosuke Mishino, her father, brings a different energy. He's written with the intensity of someone whose life has revolved around digital structures for a very long time, and his office and lab spaces quietly tell you that story with stacked papers, old hardware, and half-finished notes pinned in places where they probably shouldn't be. A neat touch is how their relationship is communicated without long monologues. You'll see Inori correcting data labels that Kosuke rushed through, or catching small errors from overwork, which implies a long history of her quietly supporting his big ideas. Adamus itself is built in a way that feels closer to a realistic security organization than a flashy anime task force. Its members talk in terms of risk, thresholds, and resource allocation, and they worry about things like jurisdiction and public reaction, not just defeating the enemy. You can see this grounded tone in how missions are framed. Briefings reference previous incidents, data logs, and protocols, giving the impression that you're stepping into an ongoing operation rather than a brand new initiative spun up just for the player's arrival. Another subtle detail is how civilian life keeps going while these people work. Even during scenes that focus on Adamas or the Misonos, you still pass by NPCs who are worried about exams, work, or weekend plans, which reminds you that not everyone is aware of the looming crisis. The game also likes to mirror Dan or KANAN's role in small background animations. You'll often see them stand a little apart from groups, positioned where they can see both the human side of a scene and any screens or readouts that might hint at digital disturbances. Friend characters and coworker serve a quiet purpose beyond just filling space. They react to the protagonist's level of concern, sometimes downplaying anomalies, and sometimes amplifying the anxiety, which lets you see how different personalities cope when technology starts acting in ways nobody planned for. A nice boring gamer-style detail is how the script uses throwaway comments to foreshadow bigger ideas. Someone might joke about the system being haunted, or the network acting like it's alive. And later, once you've seen ILIAD and the OLYMPOS Digimon, those lines start to feel less like jokes and more like accidental truths. The overall effect is that Time Stranger's human cast feels like a web of people slowly tightening around an unseen center. Dan, KANAN, Inori, Kosuke, and the staff of Adamus are all moving toward the same point in time from different angles, and the game lets you notice the patterns at your own pace instead of underlining them in bright text. Another interesting detail about Dan and KANAN is how the game uses their homes as personality snapshots. Dan's side of the space tends to be a little messier, game cases, workout gear, or stray clothes, while KANAN's corner is more organized, with neatly stacked books or carefully arranged devices, making it easy to guess who lives there even before they speak. Their animations outside of battle quietly underline those differences. Stan often stands with his weight shifted forward, arms ready to move, while KANAN's idle stance is slightly more reserved, with subtle head tilts or glances that make her look like she's constantly analyzing the situation around her. Dialogue timing also adds flavor without needing huge speeches. Dan's lines frequently land in quick bursts, as if he's trying to push the conversation ahead, whereas KANAN's responses sometimes come after a beat, giving the sense that she's weighing her words even when she's being casual. The way other characters address them changes depending on who you pick. Coworkers and friends might tease Dan about acting before he thinks, while the same people gently prod KANAN to step out of her comfort zone, which makes the world feel like it has known these siblings long before you showed up on the file select screen. Inori's interactions with them are full of little tells. She sometimes slips into dense technical language when talking to KANAN, assuming she'll keep up, while with Dan, she's more likely to simplify an explanation or jump straight to what needs to be done, hinting at how she subconsciously reads their strengths. Kosuke's attitude varies in a similar way. He might praise Dan's initiative when he takes charge during a crisis, but he tends to seek KANAN's opinion when the discussion turns to theory or long-term impact, which makes family meetings feel more like team briefings than standard parent-child scenes. The siblings' relationship to Adamas is also written with small, specific touches. When they're addressed as operatives, the language becomes clipped and formal, but off-duty conversations with the same colleagues reveal nicknames, inside jokes, and old anecdotes that show this isn't just a job, it's a workplace full of shared history. Even tiny background characters help sell the idea that Dan and KANAN are part of a larger community. Shopkeepers, neighbors, and minor staff occasionally refer to past favors, borrowed items, or old mishaps, painting a picture of lives that existed before the timeline went sideways. The game also uses wardrobe details more deliberately than it first appears. Slight differences in how their uniforms are worn, rolled sleeves, loosened ties, or added accessories tell you who's more relaxed about the rules and who clings a little tighter to structure when things feel uncertain. Voice acting reinforces all of this without needing constant emotional outbursts. Dan's delivery tends to jump slightly in pitch when he's excited or frustrated, while KANAN's voice usually tightens instead, sounding more controlled the more pressure she's under, which makes their stress responses feel distinct. During high-tension scenes, background animations for the cast do a lot of subtle work. Inori might pace or fiddle with a device, Kosuke might stare too long at a single screen, and one of the Adamas officers might repeatedly check a wristwatch or tablet, giving you a sense of nervous energy, even if the dialogue stays professional. NPC positioning in rooms often says as much as the spoken script. You'll notice who stands near exits, who drifts closer to consoles, and who instinctively moves toward Dan or KANAN when bad news hits, which quietly shows who trusts whom when the situation turns uncertain. Some optional conversations only trigger if you revisit locations after major events. These chats rarely advance the main plot, but they reveal how people process what's happening. Some react with denial, others with grim humor, and a few with quiet determination, fleshing out the social network around the siblings. Over time, small running gags develop that make the cast feel more human. A coworker might constantly misplace their ID card, a technician might always be eating when urgent calls come in, and a neighbor might insist on giving the same bit of life advice no matter how much the world is falling apart. The game also rewards players who pay attention to how people address Dan or KANAN. Shifts from last names to first names, from titles to casual nicknames, mark tiny milestones in relationships, often long before the story explicitly acknowledges that a bond has deepened. Even battle chatter reflects character growth. Early on, allies might sound hesitant or overly formal when giving support lines, but as the story progresses, those same characters start to speak with more confidence, throwing in light teasing or personal encouragement tailored to the sibling you're playing. Skill descriptions and ability names for certain characters echo their personalities. Tech-focused allies favor jargon-packed terminology, while more straightforward fighters get blunt, almost conversational move names, hinting at how each person thinks about combat and their role in it. Environmental storytelling in shared spaces helps tie everyone together. Notice boards in offices, coffee cups left in specific corners, and personalized touches on desks all suggest who spends time with whom after hours, and which departments are quietly closer than their job titles imply. Dan and KANAN's rooms change as the game goes on. New items appear, old ones disappear, and sometimes objects are rearranged in ways that reflect recent events. Souvenirs from missions, documents that shouldn't be lying around, or extra equipment left nearby after a rough day. The siblings' phones or communication devices serve as small windows into their lives. Messages from friends, unread notifications, and saved photos tell short stories, a canceled meetup here, an in-joke there, or a screenshot of some strange anomaly that caught their eye long before anyone called it dangerous. Atomos's headquarters itself evolves in subtle ways as the situation escalates. What starts as a relatively calm, orderly environment slowly accumulates more busy staff, extra equipment, and visible security measures, and you can see how Dan or KANAN react to those changes in small comments or quiet camera pans. Some of the most telling moments happen when nothing urgent is going on. Catching Inori half asleep at a terminal, seeing Kosuke stare at an empty corridor lost in thought, or watching an officer practice a speech they'll never actually give, all hint at the emotional toll that doesn't always make it into the main dialogue. Taken together, these little choices make Dan, KANAN, and the people around them feel less like pieces on a storyboard, and more like a group of colleagues, friends, and family members slowly being pulled into the same problem. You don't just learn who they are from plot twists. You learn it from the way they stand, what they leave lying around, and how their voices change when they think no one is really listening. ILIAD is introduced as more than just the digital world with a new coat of paint. It's treated like a specific branch of that reality, one with its own history, rules, and hierarchy, overseen by a group of Digimon that behave less like bosses and more like administrators of a fragile ecosystem. Right away, the name says a lot. Calling this place ILIAD links it to long, drawn-out epics rather than quick skirmishes, and that sense of age is baked into the design. Ruined data structures, half-erased symbols, and areas that feel like they've been rewritten several times over. Instead of presenting the world as pure neon cyberspace, the game mixes mythic shapes with obvious digital elements. You'll see temple-like structures built out of glowing panels, bridges that look like classical stone but shift like code, and landscapes that feel half physical, half interface. Not every Digimon in ILIAD behaves like a random encounter. Some clearly patrol specific routes, standing guard over access points or important nodes as if they've been assigned a job by something higher up, while others drift more freely, like native wildlife that has adapted to a networked environment. Each region subtly reflects the influence of a different OLYMPOS Digimon. Areas tied to fiery or sun-linked gods lean into warmth, flowing light, and motion, while domains associated with colder or more analytical figures prefer symmetry, hard edges, and quiet, pulsing effects that suggest constant calculation. Rather than explaining all of this in a lore dump, the game lets the environment do most of the talking. Changes in color palette, background animation, and even ambient particles tell you when you've crossed from one sphere of influence into another, without anyone stopping you to label it. The OLYMPOS 12 themselves sit in an interesting place between divinity and system software. They are framed as godlike, but the way they talk about ILIAD and the human world is closer to administrators trying to keep overloaded servers from crashing than to distant deities issuing prophecies. Conversations with them often mention balance, flow, and capacity. Some of these Digimon see human connections as stress on an already busy network, while others view the influx of human data as an opportunity, a chance to grow and diversify ILIAD's structures at the risk of breaking them. Small visual cues link ILIAD back to Tokyo, even before the story spells it out. Certain pathways echo the shape of train lines, clusters of towers mirror real-world skylines, and fragmented textures occasionally resemble urban signage, as if years of human data have left ghost impressions in this world. Those echoes make ILIAD feel like a record of humanity's digital activity. Every connection, upload, and experiment leaves traces, and over time those traces build up into physicalized data ruins and weirdly familiar silhouettes scattered across the landscape. From the OLYMPOS perspective, this accumulation isn't just aesthetic, it's a stability problem. They talk about thresholds being crossed and systems running hot, which suggests that the SHINJUKU event is not an isolated freak accident but the result of sustained pressure on both worlds. Encounters with the OLYMPOS Digimon rarely boil down to simple good versus evil speeches. One might argue that severe measures are necessary to preserve ILIAD, while another questions whether trying to freeze a dynamic system is even possible when humans keep pushing new information into it. As you move deeper, ILIAD itself starts to show signs of strain. Certain zones loop ambient effects incorrectly, geometry flickers at the edges of your vision, and lower-level Digimon behave in ways that feel slightly off, like processes that have been running too long without a reset. Those glitches are easy to read as mere stylistic flair, but they function as quiet warnings. The world you're exploring is not a stable backdrop. It's a living network that's slowly buckling under the weight of too many connections, conflicting instructions, and competing priorities. Human research, especially the work around new access routes, adds another layer. By making crossings between Tokyo and ILIAD cleaner and more reliable, people accidentally increase the volume of traffic, which looks impressive in a lab, but shows up as stress and distortion on the digital side. For the OLYMPOS 12, that puts your character in a complicated position. You're both symptom and potential solution, someone who embodies the expanded connection between worlds, but also one of the few who can actually move through ILIAD, read its signals, and push back when the system begins to fail. The longer you stay in this world, the less it feels like a simple other dimension. ILIAD starts to come across as a shared responsibility, a space shaped by Digimon choices and human habits at the same time, with the OLYMPOS Digimon trying, sometimes calmly, sometimes desperately, to keep the entire structure from tearing itself apart under the weight of both. A big part of Time Stranger's identity sits quietly inside its roster numbers. Instead of aiming for a small, curated list, the game commits to hundreds of Digimon, enough that the field guide looks more like a directory than a simple index the first time you open it. Scrolling through that guide early on can feel overwhelming. Names and silhouettes fly past faster than you can properly take them in, which is why the game doesn't expect you to memorize everything. It expects you to slowly build familiarity through use, reversions, and experimentation. A small but important design choice is how early you gain access to evolution and de-evolution tools. Rather than locking those systems behind late-game progression, Time Stranger lets you start looping forms relatively quickly, teaching you that going backwards is just as valid as pushing forward. That loop is what makes the roster feel alive, instead of static. You're not just climbing a ladder from baby to mega, you're weaving through a web of possibilities, shifting stats, skills, and affinities as you nudge a partner into different shapes. Digimon lines that fans recognize from the anime show up with branching options that feel like what-if scenarios. A familiar rookie might be able to go in the direction everyone expects, but also into less famous forms that reward players who enjoy digging through lesser-known entries in the franchise. Capturing and converting enemies adds another layer. Instead of simply catching a weakened opponent, you're often working with scan percentages and data accumulation, which turns repeated encounters into a slow process of building a new ally out of fragments rather than a single lucky throw. That system has a side effect that suits long sessions very well. Grinding stops feeling like pure repetition and starts to resemble a slow construction project, where every battle nudges a future partner closer to existing. Some Digimon lines hide their most interesting evolutions behind specific stat spreads or move combinations. You might need to focus on speed, or deliberately teach a certain type of attack before the desired branch even appears as an option, which encourages careful planning instead of random growth. Menus reflect this philosophy. The evolution screen doesn't just show the next step, it lays out multiple paths with silhouettes and requirements, inviting you to think about your current playstyle and what kind of team you want to pilot 10 hours from now. Many longtime players notice how often the game lets them fix earlier decisions without punishing them too hard. If a Digimon's build drifts away from what you wanted, de-evolution and retraining tools make it possible to redirect that partner without throwing them away. That flexibility makes attachments stronger. Instead of cycling through disposable monsters until you find a perfect specimen, you can take a single partner on a long journey through different forms, carrying over shared history even as their model and role change dramatically. Team building also leans into roles more than simple type matchups. Some partners excel at manipulating turn order, others specialize in healing or debuffing, and certain evolutions exist almost entirely to amplify allies rather than dealing huge damage themselves. During battle, Those roles matter because of how turn flow is calculated. Speed and initiative can let a carefully tuned team act multiple times before slower enemies, which means a partner built around support can feel just as impactful as a heavy hitter if their skills land first. A nice detail for sleepy or study sessions is how much the game respects repetition. You can set up favorite commands, use repeat options, and adjust battle speed, turning routine encounters into a smooth rhythm while still having room for deeper tactics in tougher fights. The Digifarm and training features quietly extend this rhythm outside of combat. Partners gain stats, develop traits, and unlock new potentials while they're away from the front lines, so even menu management and base visits become part of the long-term team-building loop. Players who enjoy min-maxing can spend hours here, optimizing feeds, items, and training plans. At the same time, people who just want a relaxed experience can let the systems do a lot of heavy lifting passively, then check back later to see how their Digimon have grown. Another subtle design choice is how the game surfaces information about resistances and affinities. It never forces you into spreadsheets, but it gives just enough data in tooltips and status screens that paying attention gradually teaches you which partners naturally cover each other's weaknesses. Because of this, teams often end up reflecting the player's personality as much as the meta. Some build balanced squads that can handle anything. Others lean heavily into a favorite strategy like status control, speed abuse, or raw power, then adjust the roster around making that one idea work. Time Stranger also clearly knows that some species carry emotional weight from the anime. Partners like Agumon, Gabumon, or other familiar faces are given solid, if not always dominant, evolution lines, allowing fans to stick with them without feeling severely handicapped. At the same time, plenty of lesser-known Digimon get surprisingly strong or flexible branches. Discovering that an obscure design can anchor a late-game team is part of the fun, especially for players who enjoy feeling like they've rescued a forgotten monster from the depths of the field guide. That mix of nostalgia and discovery is what makes team building here feel so sticky. You recognize enough of the roster to feel at home, then slowly sink into the process of learning how this specific game lets you twist and reshape those partners into something that matches your own pace and preferences. Taken as a whole, the system feels less like a straight line of upgrades, and more like tending a garden of data. You prune, replant, reroute, and occasionally uproot, always with the sense that every small decision today might lead to a completely different lineup, a few dozen battles from now. One of the most overlooked details about ILIAD is how consistently it uses symbolism from real-world astronomy and mythology, without explaining it outright. Constellation-like patterns appear in the skybox, floor sigils echo planetary orbits, and certain gates resemble stylized zodiac wheels, quietly tying the OLYMPOS Digimon to the idea of celestial guardians, rather than just high-level bosses. Each OLYMPOS Digimon's domain borrows elements from the myths their names come from, but translated into data. Areas linked to sun or harvest figures might show constant flowing growth in the form of streaming code vines, while regions associated with colder, distant gods lean into hard geometry and almost clinical light. The way access points are placed also says a lot about their priorities. Some OLYMPOS domains connect to human spaces through corporate infrastructure and research facilities, suggesting they're comfortable working with structured institutional activity, while others open near more chaotic data hubs, hinting at curiosity about unfiltered human behavior. Even the ambient wildlife in each area feels curated. You'll find certain families of Digimon spawning more frequently in domains where their lore or typing makes thematic sense, as if the OLYMPOS Digimon have seeded their territories with compatible species rather than just letting random code accumulate. A subtle pattern runs through the color grading of ILIAD as a whole. Stable regions favor clear, saturated tones and smooth gradients, while zones under heavy strain or close to faults in the network show harsher contrasts, noisy textures, and shadows that flicker just a little too fast. The OLYMPOS Digimon rarely refer to themselves as rulers in a proud, dramatic way. Instead, their lines often frame their role as maintenance, stewardship, or burden, which makes them feel less like tyrants and more like old programs that have been running for too long without a break. Some of them clearly disagree on how to handle human interference, One might talk about limiting access and throttling connections, while another quietly argues that cutting ILIAD off would doom it to stagnation, turning their conversations into debates between isolationism and adaptation, rather than simple good versus evil. A small design trick that sells their importance is how the camera treats them. When an Olympos Digimon appears, the frame often pulls back just enough to include large parts of the environment, reminding you that these beings are tied to entire sectors of the world, not just to their own models. Their visual effects also tend to blend seamlessly into the surrounding landscape. Particles from their attacks echo shapes found in the sky, floor, or architecture of their domains, making it feel as though the environment itself is reacting whenever they act. Even their idle poses communicate personality. Some stand perfectly still, like statues carved into the code, while others shift weight, watch the horizon, or glance toward portals to the human world, hinting at who is patient, who is restless, and who is quietly obsessed with what lies beyond ILIAD. The lore text often uses language that sounds more like patch notes than ancient prophecy. References to parameters, capacity, and load sit alongside words like fate and destiny, blending technical jargon with mythic phrasing in a way that fits Digimon's long-standing habit of treating computers like mystical artifacts. If you pay attention, you can spot areas that look like earlier versions of ILIAD. Abandoned platforms, half-deleted towers, and inactive gateways suggest that previous iterations of this world have been retired or overwritten, leaving ghost infrastructure behind like the ruins of forgotten operating systems. Some minor Digimon in these ruins behave differently from their counterparts elsewhere. They might attack on sight in one region, but behave passively or even curiously in derelict zones, as if their behavior scripts are incomplete or corrupted there. Readable terminals and floating data plaques provide fragmented commentary on all of this. They mention maintenance cycles, adjustments to resource allocation, and the occasional emergency stabilization, implying that the Olympos Digimon spend as much time tweaking ILIAD's underlying code as they do confronting external threats. Certain bridges and pathways deliberately lack railings or barriers, despite the otherwise careful world design. Standing on them gives you a clear view of data streams passing beneath, reinforcing the idea that everything here, land, sky, and path, is suspended over a moving ocean of information. There's a recurring visual of pillars or cores surrounded by orbiting fragments. These structures act as anchors, and their movement patterns subtly change after key story developments, hinting that events in the plot have physically altered the deeper logic of ILIAD even before characters comment on it. The more time you spend here, the more ILIAD starts to feel like a living archive. Certain rooms contain recorded echoes of battles, conversations, or events from earlier in the world's history, stored as looping projections or frozen data chunks that only partially play back when you approach them. Some Olympos Digimon seem particularly interested in these records. They talk about previous crises and adjustments in a way that suggests Time Stranger is not the first time the balance between human data and digital reality has started to tilt dangerously. You can also see how much they rely on predictive models. Dialogue snippets refer to simulations, projected collapse curves, and acceptable error margins, showing that even godlike Digimon are at heart running calculations and hoping their forecasts hold up under real-world pressure. One of the more elegant touches is how the game conveys distance inside ILIAD. Rather than just stretching corridors, it uses layered transparencies and parallax effects to give the sense that certain structures sit many levels above or below you, even though they're technically in the same map. Travel routes reinforce the idea of a network topology. Instead of walking in straight lines between locations, you often jump through nodes, lifts, or warp points that feel like you're traversing a graph of connections rather than a traditional geographic landscape. The names of specific zones and facilities usually mix grand and mundane language. A location might be called something like a sanctuary or citadel, while also being described internally as a cluster, sector, or hub, reflecting the dual identity of ILIAD as both sacred ground and data center. Weather-like phenomena act as visual metaphors for network conditions. Soft rainfall of glowing particles might suggest normal background traffic, while sudden storms of angular shards or streaks of light hint at packet loss, congestion, or active defensive measures being triggered. When human-built structures show up inside ILIAD, they rarely appear intact. Office layouts, corridors, and staircases are often fragmentary, hovering in pieces or partially fused with native architecture, as if the world has tried to import them and only partially succeeded. The reactions of native Digimon to these intrusions vary. Some treat them as familiar landmarks, others avoid them, and a few appear to be actively dismantling or repairing the blended spaces, which says a lot about how different factions within ILIAD view the growing overlap with the human world. Subtle sound cues reinforce these attitudes. In zones dominated by native design, ambient audio feels organic to the setting, but as human elements creep in, you'll sometimes hear faint echoes of footsteps, machinery, or environmental noise that don't quite match what's on screen. As the story progresses, certain areas of ILIAD start to look overfitted. There are layers of redundant defenses, overlapping structures, and multiple conflicting patterns in the environment, suggesting that different OLYMPOS Digimon have imposed their own fixes without fully coordinating with each other. That visual clutter is more than just decoration. It communicates the underlying tension between keeping ILIAD stable and responding to the increasing volume of human data, showing that even powerful guardians can create problems when they patch systems in a hurry. Taken in pieces, these details are easy to miss. It's only when you step back, maybe during a quiet late-night session, wandering around without rushing, that you realize how much of ILIAD's story is told through its architecture, soundscape, and the weary language of its so-called gods of data. The result is a digital world that doesn't feel like a generic backdrop. It feels like a stressed, evolving organism, shaped jointly by the OLYMPOS Digimon and by human behavior, always one heavy spike of traffic or one bad decision away from rewriting itself again. One of the clever systems sitting under all of this is the team memory limit. Instead of simply giving you a fixed party size and calling it a day, the game makes every Digimon and piece of equipment cost a certain amount of memory, so building a squad feels a bit like packing a suitcase for a long trip. This means you're constantly weighing power against flexibility. You can run a small group of extremely advanced partners that eat up most of your memory, or you can spread that cost across more modest evolutions and enjoy a wider range of options in battle. Support and utility, Digimon benefit a lot from this structure. Because some of them have strong skills and relatively compact bodies, they can slip into a lineup without demanding as much memory as a giant attacker, making them perfect for filling the last few points in your budget. The way skills are learned and inherited adds another layer of personality to each partner. Moves don't reset every time you change form, so a Digimon that has evolved through several branches can end up with a move list that quietly tells the story of all the shapes it used to have. Sometimes the most interesting builds come from mistakes. You might push a partner into a form you don't actually like visually, but in the process you pick up a skill you later carry back into a completely different line, turning an experiment into a permanent tool. Equipment is designed to feel like gentle nudges rather than hard requirements. Small boosts to speed, accuracy, or resistances often make more difference than chasing pure attack numbers, especially when they let a key support move land first or keep a fragile healer alive one extra turn. Certain accessories clearly exist for players who love status strategies. Items that increase crit chance, extend buff duration, or reduce the chance of being stunned can quietly transform a team built around control effects from interesting to consistently terrifying. Bench slots are more than just overflow storage. Digimon sitting off the active field can still gain experience, benefit from farm training, and be swapped in between battles, which encourages you to treat the whole roster as a living rotation instead of a fixed top 6. This rotation mindset fits the narrative tone surprisingly well. In a world where timelines bend and data can be rewritten, it makes sense that your party isn't static either. You're always refining, rebalancing, and experimenting as new lines and roles reveal themselves. Some side quests are clearly designed to showcase specific team ideas. A mission might pit you against enemies that heavily resist brute force but crumble under debuffs, or a dungeon might reward clever use of speed manipulation, nudging you to try partners you might have ignored otherwise. The game also has a quiet sense of humor about overbuilt Digimon. It's entirely possible to end up with a partner that knows an absurd mix of support, damage, and gimmick skills, and watching that chaos somehow work in battle can be part of the charm for players who enjoy breaking systems. For people who like to plan on paper, the roster invites chart making and theory crafting. Because so many lines loop back into each other, you can map entire routes for a single favorite rookie, plotting which branches you'll visit just long enough to grab certain moves before circling back to a final form. At the same time, the game is friendly to players who don't want to map anything. As long as you keep evolving, de-evolving occasionally, and paying attention to roles and affinities, you can stumble into strong teams purely through casual play and a bit of curiosity. Late-game content tends to reward both approaches. Bosses and optional fights are tough enough that a carefully sculpted lineup feels great to pilot, but they're also open-ended enough that unconventional teams, full of odd picks and sentimental favorites, can still succeed with smart play and a little persistence. Over many hours, this flexibility changes how you think about best Digimon. Instead of one universal ranking, you start building your own internal list of favorites based on how they slot into your strategies, how they look in motion, and which of them carried you through rough patches when the story or difficulty spiked. In the end, team building in Time Stranger feels less like solving a single puzzle and more like learning an instrument. At first you're just pressing buttons and seeing what happens. Later you're composing your own patterns, layering roles and skills in ways that sound right to you, until the roster stops being a menu and starts feeling like a reflection of how you personally like to play. Combat in Time Stranger is built around a simple idea. Turns should feel important without becoming exhausting. The battle screen is easy to read at a glance, but there's a lot of quiet depth tucked into the way turn order, skills, and status effects interact with each other. Instead of hiding speed in a vague stat line, the game makes turn flow very visible. You can usually see the upcoming order of actions, which turns every buff, debuff, and speed move into a small puzzle about who you want acting twice and who you'd rather delay. Certain skills are designed almost entirely around manipulating that flow. Moves that push enemies down the timeline, pull your allies forward, or freeze someone in place for a round can be more valuable than raw damage once you get used to thinking a few turns ahead. Damage types and affinities still matter, but they're not the only axis of decision-making. A slightly weaker move that guarantees a crucial debuff or turn delay often beats a big number that leaves the enemy free to retaliate at full power. Animations strike a careful balance between satisfying and repeatable. Powerful attacks come with clear visual and sound cues, yet they're short enough that watching them dozens of times during a long grind doesn't start to feel like a chore. An easy-to-overlook feature is how repeat commands work. Being able to reissue your last actions with a single input turns routine encounters into a comfortable rhythm, especially when you've already figured out the ideal pattern for dealing with certain enemy groups. Battle speed options add another layer of control. Players who want to soak in every motion can keep things at default, while others who prefer a more relaxed background experience can speed up animations so fights slide neatly into the pace of a study session or late-night chill. Status effects are treated with more care than in many RPGs where they're often ignored. Poison, paralysis, and other conditions tend to have noticeable impact, and some bosses are designed with the expectation that you'll lean on these tools instead of just stacking attack and healing. The game's UI gently nudges you to pay attention without shouting. Icons for buffs and debuffs are distinct and consistently placed, so once you've played for a while, you can tell who's in danger or who's about to dominate the next few turns, just by glancing at the status area. Skill descriptions do a lot of heavy lifting in keeping battles readable. Rather than relying on vague wording, they usually spell out if a move affects turn order, crit chance, or resistances, which means you can make informed choices without digging through external guides. One of the more comforting touches is how the log records recent actions. If you get distracted or sleepy, you can always scroll back slightly to remind yourself which skill triggered a particular effect, or why an enemy suddenly acted earlier than expected. Enemy design quietly reinforces the idea that this is a game meant to be replayed or lived in for a long time. Common foes teach specific lessons, how to respect a given status ailment, how to respond to sudden speed spikes, so that by the time you face tougher versions, you already understand the rules of engagement. Boss encounters tend to layer these ideas instead of replacing them outright. You might deal with turn manipulation, area of effect damage, and resist changes all in the same fight, but each mechanic was introduced gradually beforehand in a less punishing context. A nice quality-of-life element is how the game remembers your preferences. If you tend to favor certain camera angles, speed settings, or targeting behaviors, they persist between battles, so you're not forced to reconfigure things every time you load a save. There's also a quiet respect for different playstyles. Some players like to micromanage every action, while others prefer to lean on automated behavior. Time Stranger lets you tilt in either direction without punishing you, as long as your team is reasonably well built. Auto battle doesn't replace strategy, yet it's surprisingly competent when you're up against familiar enemies. Once your squad is tuned properly, you can let the AI handle routine encounters while you focus on planning evolutions, equipment, or upcoming story beats. When fights become more serious, you can take control instantly. Jumping back in to manually redirect skills or reorder priorities feels seamless, which keeps tougher battles from turning into frustrating spikes after long stretches of relaxed play. Equipment and passives often act as subtle modifiers, rather than dramatic gear checks. Small boosts to speed, crit, or specific resistances can make certain strategies feel smoother without forcing you to chase a single correct build. Over time, the battle system starts to feel less like a series of isolated fights and more like a language. You recognize patterns, anticipate enemy behaviors, and tune your team's responses until entire encounters flow almost automatically, leaving just enough mental space to enjoy the music, the animations, and the comfort of the loop. For players listening at night, that loop is where the game truly shines. Battles become a repeating cycle of familiar inputs and clear results, complex enough to stay interesting, but gentle enough that your mind can drift a little. Exactly the kind of system that works, whether you're actively engaged or slowly falling asleep with a controller still in your hands. Another small but important detail in the battle system is how clearly it telegraphs danger. When an enemy is about to unleash something big, animations, camera framing, or small visual pulses around their model usually give you a one-turn warning, which makes defensive skills and guard commands feel genuinely useful instead of like afterthoughts. Some attacks are designed less as pure damage and more as tempo resets. These moves might hit the whole party modestly, but wipe away buffs, reorder the turn timeline, or apply a bundle of status effects at once, forcing you to think about recovery and stabilizing the field before you go back on offense. Multi-hit skills have their own quiet role. They're not always the highest numbers on paper, but they interact nicely with effects that trigger on contact, like chances to inflict conditions, chip through barriers, or fish for critical hits across several smaller strikes instead of one big swing. The game also sneaks in a few panic buttons that reward paying attention. Certain support techniques or items can cleanse multiple problems at once, restore turn priority, or revive and shield at the same time, and learning when to hold these in reserve can make difficult fights feel much more manageable. Enemy AI is tuned to be just unpredictable enough to stay interesting. Standard foes follow clear patterns once you've faced them a few times, but stronger opponents occasionally break their own habits, using a debuff earlier than expected, or focusing down a different target, so you never feel completely on autopilot. Some battles subtly teach lessons about positioning within the lineup. You'll notice enemies that prefer to hit the front slot, others that enjoy picking on weakened targets, and a few that prioritize support Digimon, nudging you to think carefully about who sits where and who can survive being focused. Turn-based games often struggle with encounters that drag on too long. Time Stranger mitigates this by giving you tools to accelerate once you've established control, moves that ramp damage over time, debuffs that stack, or mechanics that reward extended combos, so late-phase cleanup doesn't feel like pure repetition. There's also an understated sense of progression in how combat sounds. Early-game fights have lighter, simpler audio feedback, but as your partners evolve and learn heavier skills, hits start to land with deeper impacts and fuller effects, quietly reinforcing that your team has grown without needing cutscenes to say so. Buffs and debuffs stack in ways that reward planning rather than spamming. You can layer small, short-duration boosts across several turns, or go for one big burst window, and learning which bosses respect which approach makes each major fight feel like its own little puzzle box. The game is generous with information after the fact. If you lose, you usually have enough log data, observed patterns, and remembered animations to adjust your strategy meaningfully on the next attempt, instead of feeling like you failed because of something invisible. Difficulty spikes tend to come from combinations rather than raw stats. A boss might not hit especially hard until it pairs a field effect with a specific move, or summons allies that complement its toolkit, making it satisfying when you finally break the synergy and watch the fight immediately become more manageable. Status resistances push you toward variety without locking you out of favorite strategies. Enemies that shrug off one type of control effect are often vulnerable to another, or to turn manipulation instead, so you're encouraged to rotate between several forms of disruption rather than rely on a single trick. Some encounters quietly encourage experimenting with underused skills. You might notice that a seemingly niche move, like one that trades some health for a big speed jump or converts debuffs into temporary boosts, suddenly becomes the ideal answer to a particular boss mechanic. The game uses optional content to stretch its combat system without overwhelming the main story. Side dungeons, rematches, and special missions often introduce enemy setups that require more elaborate planning, giving you a place to fully test intricate builds while keeping the core path accessible. Over the course of a long playthrough, you start to recognize certain rhythms of battle. There's the opening where you establish buffs and scan the enemy, the mid-phase where you trade resources and adjust to surprises, and the closing stretch where you either execute a clean finish or scramble to recover from a misread. That rhythm is what makes the system so easy to settle into during a sleepy session. Once you internalize your usual openers and fallback plans, your hands can run most of the fight almost automatically, while your mind drifts, snapping back only when you see an unusual animation or a health bar dip lower than expected. Optional modifiers and challenges give more engaged players something to chew on. Self-imposed rules like avoiding items, limiting certain overpowered moves, or sticking with a favorite theme team can turn familiar encounters into fresh tests, supported by a system deep enough to handle those constraints. Because everything is turn-based and clearly logged, experimenting is low stress. You can try out a risky combo, watch exactly how it plays out, and then tweak one element, swap a piece of equipment, adjust a skill slot, or change turn order to see how the outcome changes next time. Over time, the battles stop feeling like obstacles between story scenes and start feeling like the main canvas where your decisions are expressed. Every choice you made in team building, every tiny adjustment in stats or skills, and every preference for certain play patterns shows up there, making combat a quiet reflection of how you've decided to play this particular timeline. When people first see screenshots of Time Stranger, the simplest reaction is, "Oh, it's Digimon's version of a modern monster RPG." On the surface, you raise creatures, assemble a party, and take turns in battles, but underneath that familiar outline, the game keeps making choices that push it in a very different direction from Pokémon. One of the biggest differences lies in how partners grow. In Pokémon, evolution usually follows a fairly straight line with a clear final form, while Time Stranger treats each Digimon as a branching point, a piece of data that can be nudged into multiple futures and pulled back again if you change your mind. That reversible growth makes your relationship with a partner feel less like a one-way upgrade and more like an ongoing conversation. You're constantly deciding whether to lean into a current form's strengths or rewind and redirect that data toward a completely different role, instead of simply waiting for a level threshold and accepting whatever comes next. The tone of the story also sets it apart. Where Pokémon often frames its world as a grand adventure dotted with gyms, tournaments, and friendly rivalries, Time Stranger leans into mystery, time loops, and the consequences of pushing digital systems beyond their limits. You're not just traveling to collect badges or complete a Pokédex equivalent. Most of the time, the protagonist is trying to understand why time has broken, why Shinjuku became a fixed disaster point, and how ILIAD ended up under stress from human interference, all while living through a period where nobody else remembers that future. Another contrast shows up in how authority figures are written. Professors and league leaders in Pokémon tend to be mentors or milestones, while groups like Adamas and researchers like the MISONOs in Time Stranger are part of the problem as well as part of the solution, making their guidance feel more complicated. Even the basic fantasy behind the partner relationship feels slightly different. Pokémon focuses heavily on friendship as a gentle, universal bond, whereas Digimon often ties partnerships to growth under pressure, trauma, responsibility, and the need to adapt when a situation spirals beyond what your younger self could have imagined. Time Stranger leans into that version of the bond. Partners don't just get stronger because you walked a certain number of steps. Their shifts in form often line up with story beats, hard-won stat shaping, and decisions that reflect how you want them to function inside a fragile, overloaded world. Structure plays its part too. A Pokémon region is typically divided into clear routes and towns that form a loop back into a league structure, while Time Stranger's map is split between human spaces and ILIAD, with access points and anomalies tying those zones together like knots in a network. That networked feel changes how exploration is perceived. Moving from Tokyo to ILIAD and back again doesn't mimic a classic road trip. It feels more like tracing cables, checking nodes, and gradually revealing how deeply the two realities have been braided together over time. Mechanically, Time Stranger also invests more in menu-driven complexity. Where Pokémon is careful to stay approachable for all ages, this game is comfortable with stat tuning, subsystems, and layered evolution trees, trusting that players who show up for a story title are willing to spend time tinkering. At the same time, it doesn't reject casual play. Quality of life touches like battle speed options, repeat commands, and passive training let you enjoy the depth without having to engage with it in every single encounter, which makes it easier to treat the whole experience as a kind of interactive podcast when you're tired. The emotional arc of a typical run reflects all of this. In a Pokémon game, you might remember specific gym battles, or the moment a favorite partner evolved for the first time. In Time Stranger, the memories often cluster around realizations, connecting a past experiment to the Shinjuku Inferno, understanding an Olympos Digimon's reasoning, or finally getting a convoluted evolution line to click. For players who grew up with Pokémon and then drifted into Digimon later, Time Stranger almost feels like a response to a familiar formula. It takes the comforting core of collecting and battling creatures, then wraps it in a story about timelines, overloaded networks, and digital gods trying to keep up with humanity's messy habits. The end result sits in a unique spot. On one side, the game is friendly enough that fans of traditional monster RPGs can slide into it without friction. On the other, it leans into themes and systems that feel distinctly Digimon, branching growth, reversible forms, and a world that treats data as something that can break, heal, and remember what it's been through. Another place where the difference shows is in how each game treats failure. In Pokémon, losing a battle usually just means you black out, lose some money, and try again from a nearby center. The world barely reacts. Time Stranger folds defeat into its themes about broken timelines and overloaded systems, so setbacks feel more like glimpses of futures that shouldn't happen, rather than simple mistakes. On the design side, Pokémon deliberately keeps its math as transparent as possible. Damage, accuracy, and status effects follow rules that are easy to explain to a younger audience, even if there's hidden depth for competitive play. Time Stranger, by contrast, is comfortable with more opaque interactions, stacking passives, layered debuffs, and memory limits that reward players who enjoy digging into numbers and testing edge cases. For players who grew up with handhelds, portability used to be Pokémon's natural habitat. Short sessions, quick saves, and simple loops made it ideal for bus rides and lunch breaks. Time Stranger leans into the opposite space, long evening sessions on a couch or at a desk, where you can camp in menus, plan evolutions, and clear a dungeon or two at a slow pace. Narrative framing is another big split. Pokémon stories often revolve around personal growth framed through friendly rivalry and competition, with villains acting as loud external threats. Time Stranger approaches escalation more like a sci-fi mystery, where the real danger comes from systems pushed past their limits, and well-meaning organizations that underestimate what they're dealing with. Even the way each series talks about technology feels different. Pokémon treats gadgets as whimsical tools, Pokéballs, Rotom devices, Pokédex entries that read like fun trivia. Time Stranger presents tech more like infrastructure, servers, access points, secure networks, and digital guardians that worry about bandwidth and stability. In practical terms, that changes how exploration feels. Walking through a Pokémon city usually means hunting for items, hidden encounters, and visual charm. It's a place to rest between routes. Moving through Tokyo in Time Stranger feels more like inspecting the visible tip of a much larger digital iceberg, with cables, terminals, and research facilities, hinting at systems humming away just out of view. Creatures themselves are framed differently. Pokémon are often treated as part of a living ecosystem first and battle partners second, with emphasis on habitats, diets, and behavior in nature. Digimon in Time Stranger are more explicitly data-born entities, their forms and personalities shaped by information, human activity, and the rules of whichever digital world they inhabit. That data angle matters when things go wrong. Where Pokémon might talk about environmental damage or disrupted ecosystems, Time Stranger is more likely to describe corruption, fragmentation, and crashing nodes, as if the world itself were a giant program struggling to stay online. Multiplayer expectations also diverge. Pokémon has trading and battling woven into its identity from the start, to the point where owning different versions is part of the experience. Time Stranger, while it may include online features or bonuses, is primarily built as a solitary, narrative-heavy journey, where the most important link cable is the one between your world and ILIAD. Pacing reflects those priorities. Pokémon tends to sprinkle big set pieces and important battles at regular intervals to keep players moving along the gym or league track. Time Stranger is comfortable letting things simmer, long stretches of investigation, menu tinkering, and quieter scenes where the tension sits just under the surface rather than exploding every hour. From a difficulty standpoint, both series aim to be accessible, but they express that in different ways. Pokémon's main campaigns rarely require deep system mastery. Most players can finish with a team of favorites and a basic sense of tight matchups. Time Stranger expects you to absorb more of its mechanics, memory limits, evolutions, resistances, especially in later content, and subtly teaches them through enemy design and optional challenges. Long-term progression looks different as well. In Pokémon, your final team often feels like the endpoint of a journey. 6 partners you've refined, EV-trained, or carefully bred if you're competitive. Time Stranger encourages fluidity even near the end, inviting you to keep rewiring lines, swapping roles, and testing new combos, so your roster remains a moving target rather than a finished trophy shelf. The emotional tone attached to battles reflects that. A Pokémon showdown can feel like a sports match. Cheers, victory themes, and celebratory animations. Time Stranger's fights often carry a heavier mood, framed as attempts to stabilize, investigate, or prevent collapse, even when the mechanics are just as satisfying. Looking at world structure, Pokémon regions are stitched together as physical maps first and foremost. You walk or ride from town to town, unlocking shortcuts and discovering little environmental stories along the way. Time Stranger layers a logical map on top of its physical one, zones connected by data routes, access points and mission chains that feel more like navigating a web than walking a road. For loreheads, the difference becomes even sharper. Pokémon lore tends to be modular. Each region introduces its own myths and legendaries, which mostly stay self-contained with occasional crossovers. Time Stranger plugs its story directly into a much broader Digimon multiverse, pulling in elements like the OLYMPOS group and multiple digital worlds in a way that invites fans to connect the dots across games, shows, and side material. Aesthetic choices underline that ambition. Pokémon usually stays bright and high contrast, even in its darker moments, to maintain a universally approachable look. Time Stranger allows itself more muted palettes, heavier shadows, and glitchy overlays, leaning into the idea that something in this world is fundamentally unstable. The way each game uses nostalgia is also telling. Pokémon often references its past through remakes, returning regions, or familiar characters making cameos. Time Stranger folds nostalgia into mechanics and atmosphere, anime songs as optional tracks, familiar Digimon reinterpreted through new evolution trees, and world design that echoes older titles without copying them. Player identity plays a different role in each experience. Pokémon protagonists are usually blank slates whose personalities are implied by your actions and the reactions of NPCs. Time Stranger gives Dan and KANAN more defined traits, and then lets you steer within that framework, resulting in a lead who feels like a person in a specific situation, rather than a purely silent stand-in. Even the endgame tells you something about the design philosophy. Finishing a Pokémon campaign often unlocks battle facilities, competitions, or extra catching grounds geared toward collecting and optimizing. Time Stranger's post-story content leans toward deeper dungeons, tougher anomalies, and extra boss-level fights that encourage you to push your understanding of the systems rather than just pad out a Pokédex equivalent. For someone used to Pokémon's rhythm, stepping into Time Stranger can feel like switching from a well-lit stadium to a quiet server room. Both spaces are about creatures and battles, but one is built around spectacle and social play, while the other is more contemplative, concerned with causes, consequences, and the fragile balance of a world made of data. Taken together, these differences explain why the two series can coexist so comfortably in the same player's brain. You might reach for Pokémon when you want a colorful, straightforward adventure with clean lines and familiar beats, and turn to Time Stranger when you're in the mood for something denser, stranger, and just complex enough to keep your mind gently working as you drift towards sleep. One of the most quietly powerful parts of Time Stranger is the soundtrack. From the first note on the title screen, the music leans into slow, pulsing patterns that feel like they could loop for hours without wearing you down. The composer leans heavily on soft electronic textures and gentle percussion. Melodies often sit just under the surface, more like a heartbeat than a song demanding your attention, which makes the game surprisingly easy to leave running while you read, study, or drift off. Area themes in Tokyo have a subdued, modern feel. You'll hear distant synth chords, faint beats that mimic traffic or train rhythms, and little flourishes that only show up if you stop moving and simply listen for a while. ILIAD's music pushes things in a stranger direction. Tracks there tend to use filtered voices, echoing pads, and glitchy effects that sound like corrupted choir notes, hinting that the whole world is both sacred and slightly unstable at the same time. Battle themes sit in an interesting middle ground. There's enough tempo and rhythm to keep fights engaging, but the melodies repeat in a way that lets your brain file them as background noise after a few encounters, perfect for long grinding sessions late at night. An extra layer comes from the optional pack of anime songs. Switching to those turns ordinary battles into little nostalgia bursts for anyone who remembers the openings and endings from the shows, but you're never forced to use them if you prefer a more low-key mood. The main vocal theme ties everything together emotionally. It shows up at key moments, but you'll also catch fragments of its melody hiding in instrumental tracks, almost like the game is quietly reminding you that all of these separate areas belong to the same story. Outside the audio, the interface does a lot of work to keep the experience calm. Menus favor clean layouts, soft color accents, and plenty of empty space, so even complex screens full of numbers don't feel overwhelming. Important information tends to live in predictable places. Health, status effects, and turn order stay anchored to the same corners of the screen, which means that after a while you can read an entire battle state with a quick glance instead of hunting across the UI. The field guide is designed like a digital encyclopedia rather than a noisy collection screen. Entries are neatly arranged, silhouettes stand out clearly, and evolution paths flow in simple lines, inviting you to scroll slowly rather than rush from page to page. Team management menus reflect the same philosophy. You can swap partners, tweak equipment, and adjust skills from screens that feel more like control panels than cluttered inventory dumps, with tooltips that explain just enough without turning into long essays. A small but comforting touch is how the game remembers your most recent choices. If you favor a certain battle speed, camera angle, or sorting method, those preferences quietly stick, so every session picks up exactly where the last one left off. Even loading screens lean into routine rather than spectacle. Instead of loud stingers or flashing tips, you usually see simple visuals and short, unobtrusive messages, giving your eyes a moment to rest before the next area fades in. All of this adds up to a very specific feeling. You don't always have to be playing Time Stranger in an active sense. Sometimes it's enough to sit in a menu, listen to the music, and gently rearrange your team, letting the combination of visuals and sound turn the game into a kind of interactive screensaver. For people who like to fall asleep with a controller nearby, that might be the game's most underrated strength. It was built to handle tense story beats and complex battles, but it also understands how to be soft and unobtrusive, the sort of RPG you can leave on in the background while the soundtrack and quiet interface slowly lull you towards sleep. Some of the nicest touches only really stand out when you stop rushing and just live in the menus for a bit. Hovering over options makes small sounds that are soft and rounded instead of sharp clicks, and those tiny audio cues build a rhythm that's surprisingly relaxing when you're flipping through your team or inventory for the 100th time. In a lot of RPGs, option screens can feel like a wall of text. Here, settings are broken into clear sections with sensible labels, and most sliders sit on calm backgrounds with plenty of space around them, so tweaking volume, camera speed, or message tempo feels more like adjusting a studio mixer than fighting with a configuration panel. When you open the map, the game resists the urge to throw icons everywhere. Key locations stand out cleanly, and any extra symbols you've unlocked are usually grouped or layered in ways that don't crowd your view, which makes it easy to plan routes without getting lost in your own markers. Status screens for Digimon are another place where the design shines. Stats, skills, traits, and resistances each get their own clear zone, arranged so your eyes naturally move from portrait to numbers to abilities without having to search for them, like reading a well-designed profile page instead of a spreadsheet. Skill lists avoid the dense, cramped layout that a lot of monster games fall into. Each move gets its own row with a readable name, concise description, and cost information, plus small visual cues that hint at element, range, or special effects, so you can scan a set of skills quickly, even when you're a bit tired. Checking evolution trees feels almost like browsing a slow, soothing flowchart. Branch lines curve smoothly instead of zigzagging. Silhouettes sit at even intervals, and requirement tags are tucked neatly under each form, which encourages you to trace paths with your eyes and daydream about future builds. Saving the game, something that's usually purely functional, picks up a little atmosphere here too. The save confirmation comes with a soft sound and a brief, understated animation, almost like stamping a file in a quiet office, reinforcing the sense that your current timeline has just been safely archived. Inventory management benefits from similarly gentle design. Tabs separate consumables, equipment, and key items, while sorting options sit within easy reach, letting you reorder lists by type, power, or recent acquisition without digging through submenus. Even the text speed prompt carries a certain awareness of how people play. You are allowed to make dialogue flow just slowly enough that you can keep up when you're drowsy, or fast enough that repeat lines slide past without dragging, and whichever you choose ends up complementing the music's tempo. Possibly, pausing in the middle of exploration doesn't snap the world to a harsh halt. Background music and ambient sound continue softly behind the menu overlay, as if the game is content to wait with you, rather than forcing everything into silence the moment you hit a button. During longer sessions, little conveniences start to matter more. Confirmation prompts are placed where your thumb naturally expects them to be. Certain repetitive actions remember their last setting, and common choices like rest, feed, or train tend to sit in the same relative position in different menus. Message boxes are sized with care. Text rarely feels cramped, line breaks are thoughtfully chosen, and there's enough spacing between sentences that even long bits of exposition are easy to follow without your eyes slipping or jumping. While adjusting audio levels, subtle preview sounds help you find the sweet spot. Raising or lowering music, effects, and voice volume triggers small test cues, so you can tune each layer until it sits nicely behind your own room noise, or whatever else you're listening to alongside the game. Fast travel, when it unlocks, is folded into the same calm philosophy. You select destinations from a clean list or simplified map, watch a short, tidy transition, and arrive without fanfare, which keeps movement efficient without breaking the relaxed, slow-drip atmosphere. Notifications are kept deliberately unobtrusive. Pop-ups for new entries, achievements, or tutorial reminders tend to slide in quietly in the corners of the screen and disappear on their own, so they inform you without hijacking your attention. In base areas, interface elements and camera behavior work together to keep motion gentle. Panning between terminals, shops, and NPCs happens smoothly, and the UI overlays adjust without sharp cuts, making it easy to wander around while your brain unwinds. Rest facilities and healing spots are framed with the same sense of comfort. Soft lighting, gentle sound cues, and simple reassuring text create a little ritual. Open the menu, select rest, watch the short fade that quickly becomes part of the game's bedtime rhythm. Even tutorial prompts respect the player's patience. They appear when needed, but once you've seen them, many can be turned off or minimized, so later sessions aren't constantly interrupted by reminders you no longer require. Over time, you start to notice how rarely the game shouts at you. Sound effects stay within a narrow volume band, menu transitions avoid jarring stingers, and even big successes, level-ups, new forms, quest completions, are acknowledged with restrained, satisfying cues instead of explosive fanfare. That restraint lets other elements take the spotlight. When a track swells a little more than usual, or a new piece of UI appears for a major story moment, it actually stands out because the game isn't constantly throwing fireworks at you the rest of the time. For players who enjoy having something on while they do other things, this kind of design is ideal. You can leave Time Stranger running in the background, dip into menus between tasks, and rely on the interface to stay readable and consistent, even if you're only half looking at the screen. There's a quiet confidence in how everything is arranged. Instead of trying to impress with flashy widgets or complicated HUD tricks, the menus and music focus on being dependable, soft-spoken companions, always there, always legible, and always just calm enough that if your eyes start to close mid-session, the game feels like it's gently encouraging you to rest, rather than demanding you keep playing. Some of the most charming things in Time Stranger aren't in big cutscenes at all. They're tucked into backgrounds you only really notice when you're moving slowly. Posters, billboards, and monitor screens sometimes reference older Digimon media with logos, silhouettes, or color schemes that feel familiar without ever saying their names out loud. Certain areas in Tokyo reuse shapes and layouts that longtime fans might recognize from past games. A staircase angle, a train platform, or a cluster of vending machines can feel eerily similar to older maps, as if the series is quietly folding its own history into this new version of the city. ILIAD does something similar with its architecture. You'll occasionally see structures that resemble famous locations from earlier digital worlds, bridges, towers, or arenas, only now rendered as half-corrupted data, like memories that have been uploaded and left to drift. NPC dialogue hides a lot of playful nods. Some offhand lines echo quotes from the anime, while others paraphrase well-known bits of Digimon lore, in a way that sounds casual unless you already know what they're referencing. Even the item descriptions get in on it. Equipment and consumables sometimes hint at their origins in one or two lines, suggesting ties to previous organizations, experiments, or eras that the main story never stops to explain. Battle animations contain small flourishes that are easy to miss. A partner might adjust their stance after landing a hit, glance at allies before a support move, or show a unique reaction when knocked to low health, giving each species a bit more personality than their raw stats imply. Some status effects have bespoke visual cues. Instead of generic icons, you'll see specific glows, distortions, or overlays that make it clear what kind of condition your Digimon is dealing with, even if you're too sleepy to read the text closely. The UI for evolution paths sometimes hints at future forms long before you unlock them. Silhouettes, branching lines, and empty slots suggest that a line can go further or sideways, quietly teasing possibilities without spoiling them outright. Save points and access terminals often share a consistent visual language. Seeing the same design pop up in different contexts reinforces the idea that human and digital infrastructure are intertwined, even in places where no one is talking about ILIAD yet. Certain weather and lighting setups in Tokyo feel like deliberate mood pieces. A rainy evening or a hazy sunset might align with a key story beat, but those same conditions occurring randomly later can trigger little flashbacks to earlier scenes in your own memory. Some of the most interesting callbacks come from enemy formations. Groups of Digimon that appeared together in other games or shows occasionally spawn as a unit in Time Stranger, turning a standard encounter into a quiet reunion for longtime fans. There are also tiny, almost throwaway camera moves. In a few conversations, the angle shifts just enough to reveal a screen, object, or background detail that recontextualizes what's being said, rewarding players who bother to look past the character models. Even loading tips sometimes reference events you haven't reached yet. On a first playthrough, they look like generic advice, but on a second run, they read more like subtle foreshadowing, disguised as gameplay reminders. The longer you stay with the game, the more these things start to stack. Individually, they're easy to overlook. Together, they create the sense that Time Stranger is constantly whispering about its own connections, both to earlier Digimon works and to the parts of its story that haven't unfolded yet. All of this makes the game strangely well-suited to late-night sessions. When you're a little drowsy and moving slowly, your brain has more room to wander over these loose threads, noticing echoes and patterns that might slip past during a focused, rushed playthrough. And that's often when Time Stranger feels most like a quiet conversation with the whole history of the series. Some of the most charming details hide in how the game handles time of day. Clock changes in Tokyo subtly alter lighting, shadow angles, and even traffic density, so revisiting the same street at night versus early morning can feel like walking through two slightly different memories of the same place. Certain shops and NPCs react to that clock as well. You might find a vendor closing up with an apologetic line or a character only willing to talk about a personal hobby during off hours, as if work and downtime are built into their schedules, instead of existing only for your convenience. Loading into familiar areas after major story beats can reveal quiet updates. Posters change, background conversations shift topics, and news tickers bring up events you were involved in without naming you directly, hinting that the world is adjusting around what you've done, even when the script doesn't stop to point it out. Enemy groups sometimes gain new members over time. A corner that once hosted a simple 2 Digimon encounter might later include a stronger support unit, or a variant with different tactics, suggesting that the digital world is learning from previous battles. Walking animations occasionally sync with ambient sounds in oddly satisfying ways. Footsteps might line up with a track's rhythm, or the clack of shoes on pavement will hit the same beats as a passing train, giving exploration an almost musical feel when you're in that half-awake state. Environmental reflections provide another layer of subtlety. Windows and puddles don't just mirror generic lights, they often show distorted hints of billboards, sky colors, or moving traffic behind the camera, which reinforces the sense that the city wraps around you rather than ending where the screen does. Some dungeons use small layout tricks to make spaces feel familiar but not identical. Corridors repeat shapes and patterns just enough that you recognize the language of a place, while slight rearrangements keep you from switching off completely, sitting in that sweet spot between autopilot and mild curiosity. Observation pays off in rest areas. Benches, vending machines, and quiet corners often host the same background characters at different moments in their mini-routines, checking phones, napping, chatting, which can make the world feel like a loop you're dipping into, rather than a stage that exists only when you're looking. A few pieces of background art include self-referential jokes, fake company logos, product names, or event posters, occasionally nod to real development tools or internal code names, the kind of thing only developers and very attentive players would recognize. Even error messages are handled with personality. If you try to interact with something that isn't ready or accessible yet, the game tends to respond with gentle, in-universe explanations instead of generic "you can't do that" text, keeping immersion intact. Item flavor text sometimes comments on player behavior. Descriptions might tease you for hoarding healing items, hint that a rarely used consumable is more powerful than it looks, or joke about how many mysterious key objects you're carrying around without fully understanding them. In the digital world, low-importance machines and consoles often flicker with tiny, cyclical animations. These loops rarely draw attention, but they make server rooms and hubs feel busy even when no characters are talking, like the background processes of ILIAD are constantly running. Fast travel terminals occasionally display small differences depending on where you are in the story. Lines of text, icon colors, or even the shape of data streams can change after certain events, hinting that the underlying network has been patched or rerouted. Some music tracks contain fragments that only stand out when you're not actively playing. Letting a theme loop while you browse menus or step away from the controller reveals hidden textures, extra harmonies, tiny arpeggios, subtle filter sweeps that are easy to miss during intense battles. Dialogue options, when they appear, often have minor variations that show up in later lines. Picking a more cautious or more direct tone doesn't usually change the big story beats, but it can alter how specific characters describe you to others, especially in optional scenes. Title screen behavior rewards long-term attachment. After certain milestones, lingering on the opening menu can trigger small visual or musical changes, new partner silhouettes, adjusted camera paths, or altered arrangements that quietly acknowledge your progress without announcing it loudly. New Game Plus adds its own layer of small delights. Characters might drop different hints, some foreshadowing events you already know about, others acknowledging that the protagonist seems strangely prepared for certain dangers, as if the timeline itself suspects you've done this before. The achievement or in-game challenge system tends to favor playstyle recognition over pure grind. You'll see nods to building unusual teams, exploiting quirky strategies, or dedicating time to side activities, not just rewards for defeating a set number of enemies. Interface sounds subtly change in a few late-game contexts. Confirming a choice in critical story segments can use slightly different tones from normal, creating a sense that these decisions sit on top of a heavier layer of meaning, even if the player doesn't consciously register why they feel different. In shared hub locations, party members and important NPCs sometimes turn their heads to follow your movement. That tiny bit of tracking makes conversations feel more grounded, especially when someone looks back at you after a big reveal or gives a quick, almost imperceptible nod as you pass. Occasional rain or environmental effects in ILIAD behave like visual mood swings. Instead of literal water, you might see cascading symbols, falling glyphs, or drifting fragments of code, which look almost decorative until you remember they probably represent real, ongoing data processes. Some late-area skyboxes hide very faint, distant silhouettes. Shapes that looked like abstract geometry at first reveal themselves as gigantic structures or dormant entities when you stop and stare, hinting that ILIAD extends far beyond the spaces you're allowed to explore. During long stretches of play, the game's autosave icon can become a weirdly comforting presence. It pops up quietly at certain transitions, a little reminder that even if you're half asleep on the couch, your progress through this fractured timeline is being preserved. All of these seemingly minor touches add up over dozens of hours. They don't demand attention or drive the plot forward, but they give the sense that Time Stranger is full of extra layers waiting for anyone willing to slow down, let their eyes wander, and notice what the world is doing when the main story isn't talking. When people look back at Digimon games, there are a few obvious milestones. World on the original PlayStation, the first story titles on handhelds, Cyber Sleuth bringing the series to a wider audience again. Time Stranger quietly aims to sit next to those, not by reinventing everything, but by pulling many older ideas into one coherent shape. Reception at launch reflected that intent. Players who had stuck with Digimon through the quieter years described it as a reassuring entry, modern and polished, but still recognizably part of the strange, data-obsessed universe they remembered. Newcomers coming in from other monster RPGs often singled out the story structure and evolution systems as the parts that felt most distinct. Critics tended to highlight the same strengths. The branching partner growth, the focus on time loops, and the way ILIAD and Tokyo are tied together all came up repeatedly in reviews, especially from writers who had followed the series for a long time. Even when they pointed out pacing issues or dense menus, there was a sense that Time Stranger knew exactly what kind of game it wanted to be. Within the fan base, the game quickly became a reference point. Discussions about where should I start with Digimon began to feature Time Stranger alongside Cyber Sleuth as a recommended entry for people who enjoy heavier storylines and complex systems. It didn't replace the older titles, but it did give players another modern option that felt built for current hardware and habits. The choice to center the narrative on the OLYMPOS Digimon had a ripple effect beyond the game itself. These once edge-case creatures suddenly gained a clear central role in the broader lore, turning them from trivia answers into pillars of the setting. Later conversations about digital worlds in general often use ILIAD as shorthand for a certain type of mythic, system-level space. Time Stranger Digimon stories. Earlier works played with altered futures and paradoxes, but this game made the idea of a fixed disaster point and a long attempt to bend the timeline around it feel especially tangible. SHINJUKU's fate and the effort to rewrite it became one of the franchise's most recognizable narrative arcs. In terms of gameplay heritage, you can see it as a bridge between eras. On one side are the handheld story entries with their dense evolution webs. On the other is a generation of players used to high-resolution battles, fast menus, and quality-of-life tools. Time Stranger tries to keep the former's depth while embracing the latter's standards. That balancing act shows up whenever people compare it to other RPGs. It doesn't chase open-world trends, live service elements, or heavily cinematic pacing. Instead, it bets on a more classic loop-town, dungeon, story beat, menu optimization polished enough that it feels comfortable rather than outdated. Another reason it lingers in memory is the way it treats Digimon as data shaped by emotion and circumstance. Earlier stories introduced that idea, but Time Stranger emphasizes it by letting you repeatedly reconfigure partners in response to what's happening around them. Your team becomes a physical record of choices, experiments, and mistakes, not just a row of fixed final forms. For longtime fans, the game can feel like a quiet acknowledgement of how the audience has aged. Many players who were children during the adventure days are adults now, and Time Stranger meets them halfway with themes about responsibility, burnout, and the consequences of tinkering with complex systems for too long. At the same time, it doesn't shut out younger or newer players. The bright designs, collectible appeal, and straightforward core loop are still present. They're just wrapped in a story that assumes people might also be interested in network strain, corporate risk assessments, and digital deities arguing about capacity and growth. Speculation about future entries often uses Time Stranger as a template. Fans wonder whether later story games will return to ILIAD, revisit surviving OLYMPOS Digimon, or explore other digital worlds that operate under different sets of rules. Some hope for a direct follow-up. Others prefer the idea of standalone tales that still nod back to this game's structure. Even if no immediate sequel appears, the influence is already visible. Discussions about spin-offs, card game lore, and animated projects frequently borrow concepts introduced or solidified here, especially the idea that different digital worlds might each have their own governing gods and timelines. For people who play games to relax rather than to rush, Time Stranger has carved out a quieter legacy. It's become one of those titles you see recommended for slow playthroughs, background grinding, or as a companion while watching long-form videos and streams. In that sense, it fits naturally into the kind of experience your video is built around. The same elements that make it a strong story entry, dense systems, looping music, a world divided between Neon City and mythic data, also make it ideal for late-night sessions, where you don't mind if you forget a few details as you get sleepy. Looking across the whole Digimon catalog, Time Stranger ends up feeling like a pivot point. It gathers fragments from older games, pulls in underused groups like the OLYMPOS Digimon, and wraps them in a structure that understands modern players' attention spans and habits. Some people will always name a different favorite, maybe a childhood world game or the first time they played Cyber Sleuth. But when conversations turn to the big modern story entry about timelines and data gods, everyone knows exactly which title is being discussed. If you step back and think about it, that might be the game's quietest achievement. Time Stranger doesn't just add another link to the chain, it gives the series a contemporary anchor point, the kind of release that future Digimon projects will keep bouncing off, whether they choose to follow its path or deliberately break away from it. For now, it simply sits there, humming along on shelves and hard drives, ready to be revisited. A long-awaited promise that finally became real, a digital world that remembers more than it shows at first glance, and a story about a city on fire, told slowly enough that you can fall asleep halfway through and pick it up again whenever you're ready to step back into ILIAD. One thing that often comes up when people talk about Time Stranger is how definitive it feels for a certain slice of the fandom. Not in the sense that it replaces older favorites, but in the way it gathers so many long-running ideas, branching evolutions, multiple digital worlds, god-tier Digimon, human organizations, and ties them into one clean package. For many players, it quietly redefined what they expect when they hear Digimon Story now. A new entry is no longer just judged on roster size or battle polish. People also ask whether it has a strong central mystery, a digital world with its own identity, and a cast that feels like they exist outside the cutscenes. In discussions about the broader franchise, Time Stranger often becomes a shorthand. You'll see people say things like, "I want the next game to be as system-heavy as Stranger," or "Give me a new story that's more experimental than Stranger," using it as a reference point, even when they're imagining something totally different. Over time, it's also become a kind of measuring stick for comfort. Fans talk about booting it up after work, not necessarily to make progress, but to wander through a familiar save file, adjust teams, and revisit a few favorite tracks in the background while they focus on something else. On the creative side, it has nudged fan works in a specific direction. Stories, art, and fan games inspired by Time Stranger often lean into ideas about broken timelines, maintenance gods, and the consequences of treating digital spaces like something that can be endlessly patched without cost. Speedrunners and challenge players found their own corner in it as well. The structure of dungeons, access to early evolutions, and the way battle options unlock allow for clever route planning, and watching those runs can feel like peeking into a parallel version of the game, where urgency replaces its usual slow burn pace. Meanwhile, casual players often talk about completely different things. They remember the first time a favorite rookie took an unexpected evolution route, the moment a piece of music hit them emotionally, or the quiet satisfaction of finally understanding how to use an awkward but cool Digimon effectively. Community guides and wikis grew up around those experiences. Some focus on hard numbers and optimal builds, while others act more like travel diaries, recommending cozy grinding spots, mood-perfect tracks, or side quests that reveal surprisingly human moments from background characters. Even outside the core gaming sphere, Time Stranger influences how people frame Digimon. When the franchise comes up in broader anime or nostalgia conversations, you'll sometimes hear someone mention it as that time travel console RPG with the data gods, giving newcomers a pretty clear, intriguing mental image. In crossover conversations like "if you like X, you might like Y," the game often gets compared to slower, more introspective RPGs rather than purely to monster collectors. Fans will point out its focus on systems and mood, recommending it to people who enjoy methodical, thoughtful titles where menus and atmosphere are half the experience. Even years after release, it still sparks debates about tone. Some players want future entries to push even darker and more complex, while others argue that Stranger already hit the sweet spot between accessible and heavy, and that the series shouldn't drift too far into pure despair. Looking at it from outside the fandom, the game represents a kind of quiet success story. It didn't need to dominate sales charts or become a mainstream craze to matter. It just had to become that one dependable, deeply loved RPG people recommend to each other in late-night chats and forum threads. Within personal gaming histories, it often occupies a specific emotional slot. Players might list it among the titles they return to when life feels chaotic, a comfort game where the world is literally falling apart, yet is constantly being patched, stabilized, and cared for by people who refuse to give up on it. In that way, Time Stranger mirrors the audience that grew up with Digimon. Many fans are adults juggling responsibilities, schedules, and digital overload of their own. So a story about trying to keep a fragile, overworked system functioning hits closer to home than the more straightforward adventures of their childhood. As the series moves forward, traces of its influence are likely to stick around. Future games can lean away from its structure or deliberately echo it, but they'll almost inevitably be read through the lens it created. Is this the lighter cousin of Time Stranger, its spiritual sequel, or a deliberate break from its style? Whatever direction things take, the game has carved out a stable place in the larger timeline of Digimon media. It stands there as a quiet anchor, a modern, console-era story entry that's dense enough to analyze, gentle enough to fall asleep to, and solid enough that people keep circling back to it whenever the conversation turns to what Digimon can be at its most thoughtful. If you're still awake at this point, thanks for hanging out with me this long. If you ended up dozing off somewhere back in Shinjuku or ILIAD, that's honestly just as good. If you'd like more slow Digimon deep dives like this, you can always drop a comment with what you'd love to hear about next time. Another game, a season, a single Digimon line. And if you want these to be waiting for you the next time you can't sleep, you can subscribe so they're easy to find again. For now, though, just stay where you are. Let the music fade out, let the screen go dark, and I'll see you again in the next late night story.